EDH? Fuck is that? CEDH? Is that different from EDH? The fuck? Grixis? Jund? Abzan? Jeskat? What is all this? Wubberg? What's a Wubberg? Why is U for blue? Know what a dork is. It's people who play Magic the Gathering. ETB.
What is all this bullshit?
You know, there is a mistake I've made on my channel over the years, and that is, well, I say over the years, but like, the Magic channel isn't even really a year old. So there's a mistake I've made on this channel this year, and that is, well, assuming that most players who play Magic the Gathering know all of the terminology. It's very easy for me, being somebody who gets really, really into a game, to get wrapped up in the esoteric phrases and nomenclature that we all use in the games that we play. And Magic the Gathering, being a mechanically dense game of 30 plus years, means that there's a lot of terminology that's just kind of been accepted by the community. And if you've been playing for a long time, then you get introduced to these ideas and these words and phrases very slowly. Basically, as the community adopts them, you adopt them one at a time. But if you're new to the game and you just now decided you want to listen to somebody talk about the game, they're going to use a lot of terminology that just doesn't mean anything to you. So let's try to shed a spotlight on that a little bit. A lot of other YouTubers have done this style of video as well, but since I do want to make sure that my channel has as much of the content as it can for newer players as I possibly can make, so I hope you're okay joining me as we talk about the different words and phrases we use to describe our collective play experience while playing a card game that is 30 years old. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is a somewhat comprehensive list, so if you don't like the dictionary being read to you, maybe this isn't the video for you. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into everything. Firstly, let's talk about game types. Magic the Gathering has a lot of different ways you can play it, and if you're just wanting to play Magic, you may think, I'm gonna play that Magic the Gathering card game. That will be fun, not realizing there's like 10 different ways to play this game, and there are players who are fans of different ones and also exclusively play certain ones. So let's go over the most common one for everybody in the room first: Commander. We also call Commander EDH. This is because once upon a time, EDH stood for Elder Dragon Highlander, because the way this game format was originally envisioned, you had the different Elder Dragon characters. All of them had 7 power, and if they hit you 3 times, that would be a game-ending scenario. These dragons were also not very good, so being forced to build your deck around them was a deck-building restriction. This is basically a format where players play 100 card decks and use commander cards in lieu of the original Elder Dragon cards. You can't play more than one of every unique card in your deck, and this is usually played as a casual format. Most of these games are separated into mid-power games, high-power games, or battle cruiser games. If somebody says they want a mid-power game of Commander, they probably mean their precons, which is another word for a deck that you've bought from the store as opposed to a deck that you've made yourself. They probably want to play with decks that are at that power level. Once you start customizing your deck and streamlining it, then your deck is going to be something that's more in the high power category. But if you want to play a deck that is effectively a Rue Goldberg machine and doesn't really want other players to interact with it all that much, you may be in for a battle cruiser game, where you basically have a bunch of players at the table building their own individual boards and not actually interacting with one another. I am not a fan of these kinds of games, but some people are. Next is CEDH. This stands for Competitive Elder Dragon Highlander. This is the non-casual variant of Commander, where all bets are off, and decks must be able to win or stabilize by about turn 2 or 3 in order to stay competitive. This is where a lot of other deck types like Combo and Turbo, that we'll talk about later in the video, come into play. This is a very high money version of the game that most people will not end up playing, but for those who do play it, they find a lot of enjoyment in the high skill that comes with this particular way to play. But not really my cup of tea. Next is Standard. This is the beginning of the 60-card version of Magic, where instead of having one of every card in your deck, you have up to 4 of any card in your deck, with usually a separate ban list and all kinds of stuff that comes with it. For the Standard variation of 60-card formats, you only use cards from the Foundations set or cards from the last 3 years of the game, often referred to as a rotation of cards. This excludes cards that are made only for Commander, and if you want a good way to tell if a card is made for Commander, then go look up the card individually on something like Scryfall. That will show you what formats a card is legal in. The next 60-card format is Pioneer. Everything I said about Standard applies, but it uses cards from 2012 to present, so at time of writing, about a 12 or 13 year large card pool instead of the last 3 years. Modern is an extension of both of these, allowing for cards printed from 2003 onwards, so adding another 10 years onto Pioneer. This also includes sets that are called Modern Horizons sets, which print cards exclusively for Modern, but cards printed exclusively for Commander are still not legal in these formats. After that, you have Legacy and Vintage. These refer to formats that have almost every card printed in the game playable, with minor differences in their ban lists. These are formats that are not generally for me because they cost like $3,000 to play, but that's besides the point. Finally, Limited. Limited can mean any number of things for Magic the Gathering. It can mean the Jumpstart set, where you open up 2 booster packs, combine them together, and make a deck to play in a tournament with. It can mean a draft format, where you have 3 booster packs, and you open up one, choose one card from the booster pack, and pass it on to another person, and then build a deck off of the cards you assemble from these piles. Or it can mean a sealed event, where you open up 6 booster packs and assemble a deck off of the cards you pulled from those 6 booster packs, usually played as the pre-release event for a set, which means that 1 week before the set is officially out on every platform for Magic, we get a chance to play with it in the wild using what's called a pre-release format. The word pre-release used to mean something a lot different than it does these days. That really does it for most of the actual game types in Magic that we play right now. There are some other disparate ones on the fringes of the game, but for that, that's something you're gonna have to find out for yourself. This is basically everything you're going to come in contact with in the wild, except for, like, Cube, which is also another kind of limited set. It's basically just a subset of Draft. You have a Draft format where instead of booster packs, you make your own custom booster packs. People who make cubes are awesome. They literally help keep limited environments alive when Wizards of the Coast isn't being kind to us. That said, we'll go ahead and move on to the next section where we're going to talk about mana, because, yeah, lands are very important in this game, and you'll see why. Alrighty, next let's talk about mana colors in Magic. Mana is just the game piece that is produced whenever you tap a land, and tapping a land means turning the card sideways. But lands are an integral part of how Magic the Gathering is made. It's a part of the game's philosophy. So we have the color pairings of the game basically segmented into what are called ally colors and enemy colors. So ally colors, if you look at the back of a Magic card, every color that is adjacent to another color is its ally. There tend to be more allied colored cards, more lands that work with allied colors. They tend to have more synergistic properties, though this latter idea has slowly been abandoned by the developers. We don't have a lot of ally versus enemy color stuff anymore like we used to. As for enemy colors, yeah, look at the back of a Magic card, and every color that is not adjacent to another color is its enemy. These pairs tend to have more cards that don't really work properly with one another if we look back like 10 or 15 years, but that isn't the case anymore. There are also fewer lands that work for enemy colors, and slowly we've been getting more enemy color lands in the game, again, as this idea of ally colors and enemy colors has kind of been walked away from. Now, the next thing is a little less important, but it is fun for me, and it's the fact that colors have usually been associated with particular philosophies in Magic the Gathering. Red cards tend to be aggressive and passionate. White cards are stoic, healing. Green is about giving life and making things rampant and wild. Black is about ambition and possibly even evil and sometimes embracing death, where blue is about knowledge and being erudite. When we combine these colors for our decks, though, they form philosophies, and those philosophies underpin the story of a place in Magic's actual overarching story called Ravnica. This was a series of sets, books, and short stories about a city planet with 10 guilds housing the brunt of its populace, unless you were guildless, in which case life just kind of sucked for you. I do want to give a very quick thank you to the Reddit user Blin Lambert, who put together these infographics showing all the different color combinations. The ambition of red and the stoicness of white formed the military organization of the Boros Guild. That same red ambition with blue's curiosity led to the mad scientists of the Izzet Guild. However, if you mix that red with the wild nature of green, you get the Savage Gruul Guild. Mix that red with the death and ambition of black, and you form the Rakdos Cult, a guild that embraced death as a form of macabre theatrical play. White's stoicness mixed with blue's knowledge formed the law-giving yet judgmental Azorius Guild. Take the stoic nature of white and mix it with green's wildness to form the druidic conclave of Selesnya. White's healing nature with black's ambition forms the church and the banks of the Orzhov Guild. Green's wild nature with blue's knowledge makes the bioexperimentation build of the Simic, and green's love of life and black's embrace of death forms the Golgari Guild, which uses fungus from rotting corpses to feed the masses and even feed the guildless people. They are basically the soup kitchens of Ravnica, based on a lot of death. It's really weird. And finally, if you take blue's love of knowledge with black's love of ambition, you get the super secretive assassins and usurpers of the Guild of House Demir. These sets and books were so popular in the Magic community that the guild names have forever become the names of these color combinations in Magic the Gathering ever since. Next, Wizards tried another color experiment, though, with what's called Shards of Alara, with shards literally meaning the broken away shards from the color pie on the back of a Magic card. Every ally color combination imaginable becomes a shard on Alara. Bant, Esper, Grixis, Jund, and Naya became the common names for these color combinations thanks to the Shards of Alara block, and likewise the Tarkir set gave us a set of dragon-based clans based off of the wedge color combinations instead. These literally were formed by cutting a wedge into the color pie. And when you literally cut a wedge out of the color pie, those names for those color combinations became Abzan, Jeskai, Sultai, Mardu, and Temur, after the dragon clans of Tarkir from their own story, and thus the nomenclature of the Magic community evolved once again. The four color combinations had some words that were used to describe them, but I'm going to be honest, nobody really remembers those words because they never really caught on. And anybody that tries to go into my comment section and correct me, I guarantee you are 1 out of 1,000 people who know what those words mean. Then we have the 5-color color combination, which became known as Wooburg, since white, blue, black, red, and green were the order of the colors on the back of a Magic the Gathering card. But, yeah, the blue became U because having 2 Bs on the back made it kind of impossible to determine what a deck was supposed to be, because if my black deck is a B deck and my blue deck is a B deck, then my Dimir deck is a B deck. It's very hard to kind of tell what it is. As for the U and B problem, why do we use U to represent blue and B to represent black? Well, if you look at the first 3 letters of each of these words, B, they both share. So how do we determine who gets to be B? Well, they both have L, and L stands for land in Magic, so we can't use the L, so then we go to the next letter. Black has A, and blue has U. A already counts for artifacts, a type of card in Magic the Gathering, whereas U is completely unaccounted for anything in Magic. So blue gets the U and black gets the B. That's the logic behind it. I promise you, it is both that simple and that stupid. Speaking of colors, though, you need lands to play in Magic the Gathering to get your colored mana, so let's go over some land terminology. A dual land is any 2-color land in the game, but sometimes players specifically refer to the original 10 dual lands from Alpha and Beta that are hundreds of dollars. Nowadays, people tend to refer to those as true duals, while they'll refer to other dual lands as either just dual lands themselves or by any of the subcategories of lands that they may be. Shock lands because they make you take 2 damage, like the card Shock. Slow lands because they literally come into play untapped slower than other lands. Reveal lands because they make you reveal a card from your hand. Tango lands because it takes 2 to tango and you need 2 basic lands for these lands to come to play untapped. There's tons of sub-designations of dual lands, but they are all in fact just dual lands. The next kind of land are triomes, and we also have tri-lands as well. A triome is a land that has its 3 land type designations, which is important for game mechanics that grab a forest or a mountain out of the deck. Tri-lands, on the other hand, are lands that do tap for 3 colors like triomes, but do not have the benefit of having these type designations. That is the difference between a triome and a tri-land. Finally, there are fetch lands, lands which are sacrificed to search your library for any other lands and put them into play. These usually refer to the 10 fetch lands shown here, but they can sometimes also refer to cards like Fabled Passage, Evolving Wilds, Frozen Verge, Myriad Landscape, and other lands that grab any other land from your deck. It's a very loose category that also isn't super loose if you're being really pedantic. I said finally on fetch lands, but there is one more kind of category of land we use, and that is a utility land. Any land that has a specific purpose besides just getting you mana or fixing your colors of mana. These are cards like Rogue's Passage or Mosswort Bridge, cards that do extra things on top of being a land. And that really does it for most of your land terminology you'll have to care about. The other stuff we're going to talk about is going to be a little more hyper-specific as well, so let's go ahead and dive into card types. Everything in this section deals with card types, and it seems like it would be simple, just look at a card and say, oh, it's a creature that does X effect. But nah, we like having shorthand because we like feeling like we're part of a giant game with multiple players and a rich history that isn't just a bunch of nerds being angry at each other because somebody played Ristic Study too early. So the first card type we're going to talk about is a bear. A bear used to refer to any 2/2 creature with no other abilities. A creature with power 2, toughness 2, costed 2 mana, and that was it. Named after the original Grizzly Bear card. There's a lot of distinctions of cards like this, like Savannah Lions. Any card that is a 1 mana 2/1 is a Savannah Lions. But this is a term that has kind of been retired because vanilla creatures aren't really printed that much in the game anymore. But there is a term that has evolved from bear that we need to talk about, and that is a hate bear. A hate bear is any small creature that impacts the game in a negative way for your opponents. These are usually called hate bears. Thalia, mostly any Thalia, is an example of a hate bear. All of her cards do something to disrupt your opponents in some way, while also just being a small creature that sits on the board otherwise. Just a little guy who does nothing but make life terrible for your opponents. The term dork, however, refers to a mana dork, cards like Birds of Paradise or Lawnmower Elves that tap for mana like a land. But speaking of mana, a mana rock is any artifact that can be tapped for mana. And also, on the conversation about mana, we have fast mana. Any effect that gives the user more than 1 mana greater than the mana that they untapped with at the beginning of their turn, plus whatever mana they were able to play from their hand normally. So a card like Ancient Tomb or the Moxen, these are cards that accelerate your mana a lot and are considered fast mana. Your precon you bought the other day probably had a Soul Ring in it. This is an example of fast mana that I do in fact believe needs to be banned from Magic the Gathering, but that is a conversation for a different video. The next type of card that can accelerate your mana is called a Ritual. Rituals provide 1 or more mana greater than what you had, but only until the end of your turn. These are cards like Dark Ritual, Poetic Ritual, Seething Song. Any of these cards provide you temporary mana at a very quick rate, and we call them all, regardless of their name, a ritual. Then we have a wheel. This is any card that forces players to get rid of their hand and replace it, as seen with cards like Wheel of Fortune, Wheel of Misfortune, and Windfall. Next, we have MDFC. This is a term to refer to any modal dual-faced card. Any card that has a picture of a trading card on the front and a picture of a different trading card on the back. Usually the card on the back is a land. It is a modal card because you pick the mode of the card you want to play in your hand, either the front or the back side, and it is a dual-faced card because it has 2 faces. Again, it's really that simple. Then we have weenies. This refers to any small creature in the game. This also forms the basis of a deck type that is reliant on swarming with all of these small creatures, literally called white weenies. Then we have a Cheerio. This is any card that costs 0 mana, usually an artifact, and yes, there is a deck type called Oops All Cheerios that just runs all of these 0-cost cards. Then we have the term trick. If you refer to a card as a trick, it is usually an instant card or ability which does something to screw up combat. It buffs a creature, it shrinks an opposing creature, it prevents damage on a creature, anything like that. These are what are called combat tricks. Then we have tutors. Any card or ability that lets you look in your library for a specific something, then throw it into your hand or on top of your deck or up your opponent's left butthole. That's what a tutor is. Then you have an answer. Any card can be an answer, as long as it answers a threat an opponent presents. A lightning bolt, for instance, is an answer to a mana dork. It's also interaction, something we'll talk about in a bit. Whereas a card like Thalia, that lets all creatures come into the battlefield tapped, is an answer to a swarm deck like Krenko that wants to spawn out a lot of hasty goblins. An answer is a broad category of a lot of card types. Then we have an aristocrat. This can either refer to the creatures who give you sacrifice payoffs in the aristocrat style deck. Cards like Zulaport Cutthroat that make you gain 1 life and make opponents lose 1 life when you sacrifice things. Or it can refer to sacrifice outlets like Cartel Aristocrat, cards that make you sacrifice cards at instant speed for some type of beneficial effect. I like to categorize these cards differently though and call those ones sack outlets or sacrifice outlets, which is, again, any card that can repeatedly sacrifice your permanents for some type of effect. Then we have cantrips. Any spell that when you cast it lets you draw a single card is a cantrip. The next thing we got to talk about is something a little bit weird, but it's called a card on a stick or a card on legs, and that just means that there is some kind of important, understandable effect in the game that is repeatable or static, but it is attached to a creature if it has legs, or an enchantment or artifact if it is on a stick. For instance, if you look at the cards Enduring Vitality and Sanguine Bond. Enduring Vitality is Sanguine Bond on legs, but Sanguine Bond is Enduring Vitality on a stick, because one is an enchantment and one is a creature, but they both have the same basic understandable effect. You could even consider Mana Dorks as mana on a stick, basically. It's, again, that simple. Then we have board wipes. Anything can be a board wipe as long as it destroys some mass portion of the board state, which is the cards that are currently on the game board. If it destroys all creatures or all enchantments, all lands, if you're a monster, anything like that, that is known as a board wipe. It also might be known as a wrath if you specifically want to call everything Wrath of God for some reason, because that was one of the original effects that did this, I guess. Then we have a win condition. This is any card in your deck that is used to end the game. This can be a giant creature that punches your opponent in the face. A series of burn spells can be a win condition. A series of cards to make your opponent lose all the cards in their deck could be a win condition. Cards like any kind of alternate win condition. Beladar Sovereign. This is an alternate win condition. This is a win condition. And if we were drafting cards, this might also be called a bomb. Any card that is powerful enough to win the game, but we usually use that card or that term to refer to cards in draft. Also, some cards just have shorthand nicknames, like Ewit for E-Witness, or Steve for Sakura Tribe Elder, and it's literally because Sakura Tribe Elder is S-T-E, and we just put a V-E at the end of it, you know, for fun. That's why he's called Steve, I promise you. Then we have Mom, or Mother of Runes, Skoos for Scavenger Ooze, Young Peasy for Young Pyromancer, and yeah, then there's also the woman who could step on me and ruin my life, and I would thank her for it, also known as Savra, Queen of the Golgari. But that's kind of it for our little esoteric phrases for what cards do. Now let's talk about game mechanics, and yeah, that actually is different, so let's talk about that. Now, if we are talking about game mechanics, the most important game mechanic to know that we don't use slang for, but it's going to come up in this part, is the stack. Anytime an effect happens, it goes on what's called the stack. Any response to a card on the stack is placed on top of that effect in the metaphorical stack of effects that have happened. I cast an instant, you cast a counterspell against my instant, I cast a counterspell against your instant. We have created a stack of 3 effects, and then Joe over there casts a Return to Nature on Samwell's artifact because he decided to do it at this moment just to make the stack higher, even though it didn't change anything that happened during that time. Tapping a land does not go onto the stack. Damage does not go onto the stack, but effects and triggers and anything like that goes on the stack. A trigger is literally when a card automatically does something based on some effect in the game. So Zulaport Cutthroat, who I mentioned earlier, that ability that makes you lose a life and your opponents gain a life, that was Zulaport Cutthroat's triggered ability. Then we have the mulligan. At the beginning of your game, if you don't like your hand, you can throw it all away and draw a new hand with 1 fewer cards, because you take 1 card from your hand and throw it to the bottom of the library as many times as you want until you have no cards left because you gambled it all away, which probably cut deep for some of you. You did need more than 2 lands in your opening hand, though, so maybe build a deck a little better. Anyway, your grip is the cards that are in your hand. So if I say you've got a full grip, it means you have 7 cards in your hand. This is a full grip because 7 is the maximum hand size a player can have. Speaking of hand size, if you are hellbent, this means you have no cards in your hand. This refers to a mechanic from Ravnica that the Rakdos Guild used, literally called Hellbent, which was based on not having any cards in your hand. If I bounce a card to your hand, that is me returning any permanent to your hand. Whereas if I blink a card, that is when a card leaves the battlefield and then immediately comes back down onto the battlefield. Speaking of cards on the battlefield, an edict makes you sacrifice your cards that are on the battlefield. But if your cards were in the middle of blocking and might have been killed, if I cast a fog, it blocks the combat damage, and any effect that does this is just called a fog. Swinging, on the other hand, which would have caused somebody to cast a fog, happens whenever you tap a creature during combat. It's called a swing because of the swinging motion that a creature makes when it is attacking. Also, swinging sounds like punching somebody, which sounds very funny. Then we have what happens if somebody is swinging at you, which is a chump block. This is what happens when a weak creature blocks the attack of a stronger creature, often in a way that will cause the chump blocker to die. Speaking of dying, a clock is something that happens if the game is going to end in a set number of turns due to some type of effect. For instance, if I play a 6/6 unblockable and my opponent has, say, 30 health, I've put them on a 5-turn clock, as if I hit them 5 times, they will lose the game, and there's no way they can interact with my 6/6 unblockable creature unless they kill it. Or if somebody has, say, played a bunch of guild gates on the board, and they're about to play the card called Maze's End, I may have put my opponents on a 1-turn clock, because Maze's End forces me to wait until I've untapped my lands in order to tap it to win the game. The guild gates themselves are part of a cycle of lands, and this is a term used to refer to any set of cards printed with mechanically or thematically similar abilities, usually in different colors. Dark Ritual, Giant Growth, Lightning Bolt, these are all part of a cycle of spending 1 mana on something and getting 3 of something. The guild gates are an example of having a bunch of lands that are all very similar in that they are gates, and therefore are a cycle of lands. Then we have a mechanic that you're going to have to deal with for basically your entire time playing Magic, something called an ETB mechanic. This stands for any card that enters the battlefield. Wizards changed the enters the battlefield effect to an effect called enters, but that sounds a little too much like sexual intercourse, and we're Magic players. We don't really have a whole lot of that. So ETB it is then until the end of time. If a card is a type of interaction, it means that it is any card that can remove a game piece from an opponent. A card that interacts with your opponent's hand, like say Thoughtseize, allows you to remove an important card from their hand. A counterspell interacts with a card on the stack, and a card like Return to Nature interacts with a card on the field. Speaking of counterspells, a counterspell is any type of interaction that specifically removes a card while on the stack, and only that. There is a card called Counterspell, but they all are called a Counterspell. Then we have the other way a card might leave the stack, called Fizzling. This is what happens when a card is supposed to be on the stack, but instead of being stopped by a counterspell, it is stopped by some other game mechanic. Like, say, I try to lightning bolt my opponent's creature and they sacrifice it. My lightning bolt has no target left, so it fizzles and goes to the graveyard useless, instead of me being able to pick a different card to blow up with it, for example. Speaking of blowing things up, you can easily blow an opponent up using something called the fire breathing mechanic. This is any effect that causes you to pay 1 mana to give a creature +1/+0 temporarily. Any variation on this effect has been called fire breathing. Then we have ramping. Any effect that allows you to build up your mana base much faster than the typical turn count would allow for. At turn 6, at max I usually would have 6 mana, but if I've casted a card like Rampant Growth, a type of ramp, I will have more mana than my opponent does on turn 6, as it let me get a land out of the deck early. Speaking of mana, floating mana is what happens when I tap lands, but I do not immediately use the mana that I have generated with those lands. Speaking of floating mana, you may be floating mana to hard cast a creature. This is what happens when you cast any expensive card for its mana cost, which is just the normal way of playing those cards. But the reason we say hard casting is because there is an opposite of hard casting, which is called cheating. This is what happens when you circumvent that mana cost in any way. A card like Omniscience allows you to circumvent the mana cost of spells you cast. A card like Reanimate allows you to circumvent the mana cost of creatures if you have them in the graveyard already. Speaking of that mana cost, though, we use the term CMC to refer to the mana cost of a creature. The reason we do this is because cards once were printed with something called the converted mana cost, an older way of saying the card's mana value. So this card on screen here has a mana value of 5, therefore I would say it has a CMC of 5. Yes, mana value is only one syllable more than CMC, and CMC sounds way more difficult for a new player to understand, but it is technically shorter and older, so it will trump everything forever. That is the logic of Magic players. I promise you it is that strange and that stupid. Then we have your mana curve. This is the comparative cost of any spells in your deck. You want this generally to look like a curve, a decay curve where it goes up and then decays down. Lots of low mana cost cards and a few high mana cost cards at the end, unless you're playing a specific kind of deck that has a different strategy, which we'll get into decks and strategies here in a bit. But speaking of that mana, if you've got too much of it, that's called mana flooding, where you've got so many lands in your hand, but you're unable to cast spells. But if you can't draw any of those lands at all, we would call that being mana screwed. Then we have the stuff that happens in a game. You are the arch enemy if in a 4-player game, it's turned into a 3 versus 1 game because you've become too powerful. But if somebody attacks you and they pissed you off, so you attack them back, that is called cracking back, or a crackback. Usually, you swing a bunch of big creatures at somebody, and they swing a bunch of creatures back at you in retaliation, and that is the crackback. But swinging out your creatures and using all of your mana for a big crackback is called tapping out. If you tap all of your lands and therefore have no available mana to cast any spells, then you are tapped out. This is usually used in the context of saving your big plays until your opponent is tapped out and therefore can't respond to them with any kind of counter spells. Then we have things that may happen on a given board, like sacking. This is just short for sacrificing a creature. Milling, which is short for taking a card from your deck and throwing it into the graveyard. We also call the deck the library because Magic is weird and quirky. Then we have top decking, which is when you are basically stuck having no cards in your hand and you are stuck in what's called top deck mode. You have to rely only on the cards on the top of your deck. Then we have EOT, which stands for end of turn. This usually indicates that there's something you need to be doing at the end of the turn, so you say, EOT, I do this. Speaking of turns, time walking is what you do when you take an extra turn, because there was a card called Time Walk that allowed you to take an extra turn, and players adopt it because it is old and will never be usurped by a different term. Yes, Magic players are this way. Then we have gold fishing, which is playing a game with no opponent to see how your deck runs on its own. This is also the reason why one of the big Magic the Gathering databases is called MTG Goldfish. And that does it for most of the stuff that happens in a game, but we also need to talk about the stuff that happens before a game. Like when you build your deck. Deck types have their own slang we've used to describe them as well. That way we don't have to describe all 99 or 60 or 40 cards in your deck to figure out what it's doing. So let's talk about the slang terms we have for our own decks. Now, in no real particular order, we have red deck wins, which stands for red burn decks. Voltron decks, which stand for decks that suit up one creature with equipments and enchantments to try to win the game. Aggro decks that try to win the game fast. Control decks that try to remove cards from the opponent in order to get a beneficial game state for themselves. Mid-range decks, which is the middle ground between control decks and aggro decks. Lots of aggro, but also lots of control cards. Stacks decks that are somewhat like Control, but focus mostly on resource denial instead of removing the resources from your opponents. Then we have Tempo decks that tend to play on the back foot, letting their opponents get close to winning before swinging with a tempo win in their favor, usually with some kind of combo. They want the game tempo to be in the opponent's court, and then, like a pendulum swing, they want it to swing back into their court. These decks are usually weak to aggro decks that can beat them early before that pendulum swing swings their way. Then you have combo decks that use any number of strategies that often include 2-card infinite combos, like say Exquisite Blood and Sanguine Bond, which loop together to create infinite damage. Then you have turbo decks, not to be confused with aggro decks. These are combo decks with the philosophy of an aggro deck. They want to put 2 cards together to win the game, but they want to get to those 2 cards as fast as humanly possible. Then you have reanimator decks, any deck that reanimates big creatures from the graveyard to win the game. Enchantress decks, which focus on playing enchantments on the board and letting enchantresses, like Viridian Enchantress, give them draw power. Please note, Enchantresses is like anything else we've said here. A old card was printed that said the word Enchantress, so now we call every card that does that effect an Enchantress forever, because Magic the Gathering players do in fact operate this way. It's weird and dumb, but I love it, so we're here. Then we have big mana decks. These are decks that use ramp to quickly get to an obscene amount of mana and resources to win the game with a card like, say, Genesis Wave that benefits from having lots and lots of mana. Then we have Spell Slinger decks that win without using too many creature cards and focus on casting a lot of instant and sorcery spells. And then Storm decks, the final sweaty version of Spell Slinger decks that look to copy their spells multiple times using the Storm mechanic for instant game wins. Then we have Soul Sister decks that focus entirely on gaining life, using cards like Soul Warden and Essence Warden. And yes, once again, we call them Soul Sisters because so many of the cards said the word soul once upon a time, and now we can't get away from that word. Because, again, it's Magic the Gathering players. Aristocrats are decks that focus on sacrificing their own cards to win the game. And Gain and Drain decks use aspects of Soul Sister and Aristocrat decks to force your opponents to lose chunks of life as you gain chunks of life. Then you have Tribal, Typal, or Kindred decks, depending on how edgy you want to be. These are decks that are focused on a singular creature type. Elf Ball is a type of Tribal deck. Dragon's Matter is a type of a Tribal deck, or a Kindred deck. Go Wide decks want a board with as many creatures as possible, whereas Go Tall wants a board with as few creatures as possible that are gigantic instead of small and going wide. Group Hug decks try to gift as many free cards to your opponents for various reasons, whereas Group Slug decks work similarly but try to punish your players for engaging in the gift giving. The Valgavoth Precon is a Group Slug deck, for instance. Then we have something adjacent to these called Politics decks. They fall into either of these categories, but they tend to focus mostly on negotiating deals with your opponents in a way that allows you to win the game because of some bad deal that happened. The Brina Precon is a good example of a Politics deck where it gives gifts to your opponents, but many of the cards require some kind of negotiation, like Promise of Loyalty, where players promise not to hit you with a creature on their board in exchange for being allowed to keep it, but they lose everything else on their board. Sometimes these also use voting mechanics, which are ways that force your opponents to vote on certain game actions that happen. Politics decks are really weird and esoteric and hard to define because they just involve messing with your opponents in political ways. We also call talking to the other players at the table about the game politicking, so just throw it all into the trash. Magic players are weird. Then we have Stompy decks, which use big creatures to run over other players to win. This is somehow different than Go Tall decks. Then we have Super Friends decks, which focus on using Planeswalkers as a main deck building piece for their varied and strong loyalty effects. They are the Super Friends because Planeswalkers are the superheroes of Magic the Gathering. Kind of, sort of. I really think Jace should be dead. Then we have Pillow Fort decks. Decks that try to focus on blocking people from attacking you or interacting with them. Politics decks tend to also be Pillow Fort decks, and so do Group Slug and Group Hug decks. These are all things that blend very easily together, like a bunch of different melted ice creams. Then we have Prison decks, which focus on locking down your opponent's cards, typically under lots of enchantments. Token decks, which focus on the go wide mechanic, but specifically use tokens instead of real cardboard cards. Counters decks are the opposite of this, in that they focus on adding a lot of counters to an individual creature to beef up their power, like a go wide versus a go tall deck. But unlike go wide and go tall decks, counters often have abilities that let them throw them on all your creatures, so if you have a tokens deck with a counter sub-theme, you end up with a bunch of just really big tokens. It's weird. This game is complicated. Then we have Matters decks. This is any deck that has a specific game mechanic that they think matters. Lands Matter decks focus on things like the landfall mechanic and having lots of lands in play. X Spell Matters focus on having decks with X in their mana cost to win the game. There is another adjacent type to this called an Oops All deck, which usually means any deck that has nothing but one type of card in it. An Oops All Lands deck is all lands, an Oops All Spells deck has no lands, but you can also use it to refer to any type of deck that has an obscene amount of a card that you typically would have a few of. Like, I use the deck Oops All Lieutenants because my Sauron deck focuses on different commanders that I'm not playing. It could also be called a Commanders Matters deck, but that would sound weird, so this game's weird anyway, and nobody has given me any flack for the name of the deck except for me saying a card was a lieutenant, because they thought it only meant cards with the lieutenant mechanic. And I'm gonna be honest, I thought affinity decks were cards with the affinity mechanic, but apparently Hardened Scales decks are affinity decks, so I give the fuck up. The list goes on and on and on. There are 30,000 cards in this game, and deck types can get so granular that we will be here all day. Jesus Christ! Oh, and if you thought that Magic the Gathering players could escape the slang of this game, you're incorrect, because even players themselves have slang names for themselves, gifted so lovingly by Wizards of the Coasts. Timmies love big numbers and crazy effects. Johnnies like winning the game on their own terms and tend to be kinda hipstery. Spikes like winning the game at all costs, and Vorthoses care about aesthetics and lore. And these are actually the design signposts that Wizards of the Coast uses when they are trying to create their cards. They want to make big numbered cards for Timmies. They want to make really interesting strategies for Johnnies, and they want to make very efficient strategies for Spikes. And then they literally have a card called a Story Spotlight card for the Vorthos players. They literally use us as psychographics to design their own card game. And that is a somewhat comprehensive list of all the Magic the Gathering slang there is to know. And this video will be irrelevant about a week after I post it, because like all language and slang, it will update here in about 10 minutes. And then there will be some new term that I forgot, or there's already some term I forgot in the comment section below. Who knows? I have no idea. What the fuck is a Grixis? I'm kidding, I know what a Grixis is, and I know exactly why Grixis was favored by Nicol Bolas, because I'm a Vorthos to a degree, and a Johnny to a degree, which is why I build budget decks, and a Spike to a degree, which is why I build decks as efficiently as I can, and I'm starting to get a headache. I'm gonna go order some food and go rethink my life and this entire channel. This video is going to take so long to edit as opposed to my normal content, but you know what? You know what, Vice Rhino? You know what? You got your wish. A video about all the Magic the Gathering terminology. I guess. If you like my work and what I do, please check out my Patreon. And if you really like the work and what I do, maybe consider subscribing. And maybe following me on Twitch, where I play a lot of World of Warcraft and sometimes Magic Arena. I don't know. Maybe do all those things. I'd appreciate it. Anyway, thank you for being here. I'm exhausted. I stayed up till 6 in the morning writing a script for this, and now I am tired because I am voicing it at 3 in the morning the following day. Thank you for watching. Insert end of video tagline here. Hey, just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help keep me afloat and help keep this channel going. YouTube and Twitch are wonderful platforms, but at the end of the day, stability is not one of their strong suits. If you want to support my channel, then obviously Patreon is one of the best ways of doing that. Link is in the description. But I do want to personally thank everybody who has contributed to the channel. Those people would be Red Joker, Purple Poundini, Jemshin, Britzkrieg, Jupe the Malignant, Michael, Ravalern, Mabbity Babbity, Astral Frontier, Autumn and Angel, Nixie Chan, Mark Anthony, Victorian Alchemist, I'm not saying the last part of that, and you know that. Arcton Arclacier, Kiratorian, Dren Hadamata, Jordan M, John L, Lord Bleck, Smiling Game Master, and Fire Shard. And everyone else who supports my channel and lets me do what I do full time. This is a dream job of mine that I never believed that I would be able to take full time, and with your help, I've been able to do it. So thank you so very much for that. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you all enjoy, and I hope you all are having a wonderful time. I will see you all in the next one, hopefully.